Hi, and welcome to this webinar on underreporting and the implications for serious injury and fatality prevention. I'm delighted today to have a couple of people of extreme expertise to help me unpack and explore this really important topic in a lot more detail. So I'll welcome Dr. Amy Hawkes and Warren Smith to the webinar. Hello, both.
Hi, Anne, and hi, everyone.
I'll do a quick introduction of you both so everyone knows who you are if they haven't heard of you already. So Dr. Amy Hawkes is an endorsed organizational psychologist with experience in organizational development, leadership, culture, and well-being. She's experienced in both research and consulting and has conducted individual and organizational interventions, large research projects, and has 10 years of experience in academia. A little unknown fact about Amy is also that she has a house full of unfinished craft products, so a bit of a closet crafty there. And we've got Warren Smith joining us as well, and he's the founder of Incident Analytics. And Warren has a background in operations management, organizational development, HR management, leadership, and culture development. He has expertise in safety performance improvement and has been developed in over 2 decades. He's worked extensively with large and medium-sized enterprises and takes a very pragmatic approach to safety. And he told me leading into this webinar, he's got a serious addiction to bike riding and red wine, preferably both not at the same time. So lovely to have you both on board, and thank you everyone for joining us. We've had close to 300 people register for this really important topic, so it's been awesome to have such an uptake on this really important area of focus for many organizations. Just before we launch into the meaty stuff and talk about the agenda for the day, a quick introduction into Centres for those of you who may not be familiar with us. As Centres, our mission is to change the lives of individuals and organizations for the better every day. We do that through the application of psychology and neuroscience to improve leadership capability, team engagement, and overall organizational culture, particularly focusing on the areas of safety and well-being. So feel free to look up our website if you want to know more about who we are and what we do. To launch into the agenda for today, now a bit of context that I found out leading into this agenda is that 45% of serious incidents fly under the radar. So by fly under the radar, organizations don't pay deliberate and conscious attention to them. And 29% of incidents attract unnecessary effort. So this is a really interesting topic to unpack, because what it potentially tells us is that we're not spending our limited resources, our finite resources in terms of time and effort, focused on the right areas. So we're going to unpack these stats and look at what sits underneath these and the implications for organizations by covering off on these four key topic areas. Firstly, we're going to learn about underreporting and the key drivers of underreporting. We'll spend a bit of time unpacking that. We're going to look at the importance of accuracy in identifying potentially serious injury and fatality events. We're going to learn about the importance of weak signals to future serious events. And finally, we're going to look at some practical ideas and strategies you can consider to change the way your organization responds to incident reports. So we'll launch into that topic in just a moment. A little bit of housekeeping though. We've already had a bunch of questions come through on email, which we will cover off as many of those at the end of the webinar as we possibly can. But also feel free to pop any questions or thoughts that you may have into the chat or into the questions section of the control panel that's up on your screen as well. If you are near a screen, we will be running polls throughout the webinar as well. So we encourage you to participate in those polls because it helps us to hear your voice and to get some context about where people's heads are at on the call. So without further ado, we'll launch into the idea of underreporting and what on earth is underreporting. So would you mind kicking off, Amy, and covering off a little bit about what underreporting is?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Anne. Underreporting is probably familiar to a lot of people on the call today, but it's the idea that a hazard, a near miss or incident has occurred or been observed and it hasn't been reported through the normal processes. So that means that the organisation, the safety team, leadership, they don't have the information that they need, as you said, to choose where to target their attention. And there's a whole range of different reasons for why this occurs that we can go through today. Associated with underreporting is also inaccurate reporting. So that's where we might have people downplaying severity. So they have put in a report, but they haven't put it in properly, or potentially not knowing what information is important to report on. So there's a few different issues that go on in that reporting process, underreporting being that kind of avoidance or the lack of reporting associated with a near miss or an incident.
Right. And look, it might be obvious to a lot of people on the call, but why is it important to get that accurate, that good data?
Yeah, I think it's about having that information, and knowledge is power. And if we've got the right insights and the right information, then we can start to take the right actions. If we're not doing that, then we're risking people's lives, we're risking injuries, we're risking loss of productivity, and we're also influencing our culture. So I think it's a really important thing for people to be tackling.
Great, thanks, Amy. Warren, why is underreporting an important topic to talk about from your perspective?
Well, yeah, and that's a great question. Our main concern when it comes to serious injury and fatality risk reduction, we've got to understand what is the real nature of our risk management profile. You know, in any organisation we might work within, we need to understand how well is risk actually being managed at the front line. And if we don't actually have good data about the nature of things that might be failing, people making poor decisions sometimes in situations, sometimes equipment failures, all of those things that we might sneak through and decide, I don't think I'll bother reporting it, I think I'll fix it right now. We don't actually have the data we need to get a sense of what is the real risk profile of the organisation. So we can sometimes lead with a little bit of a complacent view as a result of that.
Yeah, great. Yeah. And so what percentage of incidents do you predict, Amy, go underreported in a lot of organisations?
So we've actually done quite a bit of research on this, and our average across all of our research projects over many years is actually sitting around that 25% underreporting. But I have seen clients achieve an underreporting rate down close to 1%. And I have seen underreporting rates sitting over the 60%. So there's a big range there. But if we look at that average across the research, then what we see is about that 25%, which is 1 in 4, which is actually quite a substantial number.
Well, and based on what we've covered already, we're missing out on some really valuable insights by not getting that data. So an opportunity for people on the call to participate. We're curious to hear from you. To what extent are incidents/near misses going underreported in your organisation? You may not have the data, but you might be going a little bit on instinct here. But we're curious to hear from everyone what percentage, or to what extent near misses go underreported. All right, so we've just got those coming in. So is it A to a great extent, B somewhat, C very little, or D not at all? To what extent are incidents and near misses going underreported in your organisation? Okay, well, we might shut that poll down and we'll see what people said. I can't see those results. Can you guys? I've had an issue.
We've got 82%
here we go.
in total with a yes, basically.
Yeah, okay. I found the click box. Near miss for me. So we've got 26% to a great extent, 56% somewhat, 17 very little, and 2% not at all. So yeah, to your point, Warren, quite a significant amount of incidents going potentially underreported from the people we've got on the line. So Amy, why is this the case? Why is this underreporting occurring in many organisations?
Yeah, I think actually Warren mentioned briefly just before that often people kind of think, I can fix it myself, I'll deal with it. And so that's something that we hear a lot. There's other reasons that sit around the actual reporting process. So often we'll hear it's time consuming, it's difficult, it's clunky, and attached to that is the lack of follow through. So people will say things like, I've reported before and I never heard anything back, or I've reported before and nothing ever changes, so what's the point? And so you've got that kind of combination, that system and the process that's occurring, and those two being blockers to reporting. And the last and probably most serious that we see in about 30% of cases, almost a third, is that there's this sense of fear or blame attached to reporting. And so that's a really serious situation if people are actually fearful of what might occur to them. And we've had people say things like putting in a report is like putting your head in a noose, and so there is that real sense of this being quite a serious thing to do, and potentially your job's at risk. And that's where, again, that's a huge blocker and something that needs to be dealt with.
Absolutely. I mean, it talks to a lot of the modern current research coming out around the requirements for organisations to have good psychological safety and trust in order to create that two-way conversation. Where do, I mean, organisations focus a lot on reporting. Where do a lot of the drivers on what gets reported come from, Warren? From your experience, like in terms of what organisations pay attention to versus not pay attention to, where does often that initial focus come from?
I think if I understand your question correctly, and it's probably more about obviously there's a certain type of incident that's always going to be reported, like too hard to hide.
Yep.
And obviously organisations would expect those things to be reported fairly routinely. Now, it's their response to them, of course, will tell you whether or not it's actually going to be a safe thing to do that in future, from a frontline worker's perspective, as Amy's just described. But it's in that response to each incident that the organisation gets its chance to reinforce either negatively or positively, to its frontline workers, whether that's actually going to be a good thing to do. Ideally, what you want frontline operators in particular, who are right at the working interface, you want them to feel like it's actually a useful thing to do to report that information to the organisation. And the only way you can do it is to effectively have a fairly solid learning culture approach to incidents, as distinct from just simply an administrative process. A lot of organisations tend to take the focus that it's a compliance requirement. If something bad happens, we need to know about it, just because we need to know about it, rather than taking a more constructive approach, which is we actually want to do something with this that'll actually help you in the long run, because we can actually reduce your exposure to risk if we get it right. I don't know whether that answers your question.
Yeah, it does, Warren. And I think what it plays into is the fact that a lot of the reporting that gets rolled up to an organisation ends up being spoken about at a board level. Often what the board will focus on will have an impact on what is focused on at a senior leadership level, or executive, senior, middle management, and frontline level. So how do boards play a role in this culture of reporting from what you've seen?
Yeah, well, boards tend to, unfortunately, to have fairly confined levels of information provided to them, usually serious stuff. So they're certainly not going to miss the serious incidents that come through. Typically, in a board report, there'll generally be a requirement, for notification of anything that was serious, that has a serious outcome. A serious actual outcome, as distinct from a serious potential outcome, and that's a big distinction to make. So what they're seeing these relatively rare issues pop up that are very, very serious in nature, and there tends to be sometimes almost an over-response to that, which then starts to drive reporting. It unfortunately affects the reporting being driven underground when there's that overreaction. But what they're missing, of course, is all of that other, kind of potential risk information, which is indicated by things like near misses, lower level incidents, lower consequence incidents that could have, if not for luck, been really, really serious. And the quality of the information tends to still be lost time injury rate related, which is, as we all know, is an economic measure. It's not actually really a risk indicator, and it doesn't really tell us actually what's going on at the front line.
Yeah,
so there's a lot of work to do in that space.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? Because the board probably needs a certain different type of information or data from what you're telling, but they're asking for for a lot of that lag indicator actual consequence information, and it may or may not be telling them the story that they need to know to be able to have appropriate due diligence over the company. Yeah.
We're not going to get away from outcome data. I mean, I'm not suggesting for a second here that at that level we're going to move completely away from those kinds of lag metrics as indicators, but we need to balance it with with the inputs and the lead metrics to give them a sense of what's actually driving those numbers.
Sure. So I'd be curious to hear from, again, people who've dialed into this webinar about their experience of reporting to the board, or what gets the most attention from the board. Is it A, lag indicator data such as lost time injury frequency rate or injury frequency rate? Is it B, the lead indicator information such as near miss reporting, hazard reporting? C, has your organisation started focusing on serious injury potential data as opposed to actual consequential data? Is there much time spent around precursors to serious injury and fatality potential events in D, or letter E, data around patterns that indicate system failure? Where do you see the board getting, for lack of a better term, the most energized when certain data comes through? So we've got those numbers starting to roll in at the moment. Still got those numbers ticking over a little bit. Give it another minute or so. Okay, I think we've just about done now. So we'll throw those results up. Thanks, Cassie. And what the information tells us is that lag indicator data, 63%. That's the focus for boards. And then coming next is we've got some 15%, focusing on lead indicator data and serious injury and prevention potential data. Got 0% focusing on the precursors around SIF events, and we've got 7% focusing around patterns that indicate system failure. Amy, is this surprising to you at all?
No, it's not, and I think Warren made it really clear there too. These sorts of lag indicators, they're not going to disappear. I think those numbers really show there's great potential for improvement and identifying other areas. It's nice to see that there is some interest in that lead indicator from the board, and I think they're probably the trailblazers that are leading the way, and that's really nice to see that too.
That's great. And so, Warren, what are we missing out on when we don't focus on that lead and potential data? What is the board not getting access to by having such a strong focus on that lag indicator data?
Yeah, well, they tend to look in the rear vision mirror for starters. I mean, I think it's notoriously difficult to predict future events by just simply looking at a few recent events that have occurred that were unplanned and unfortunate, in terms of their outcome. They're not very good predictors of what's going to happen. If I've got some fall from height issues, in this particular month, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to have the same fall from height incidents in the next month or the next quarter or the next 6 months. You can be what some people would term unlucky in some instances. So what you need is lead indicators of weak signal data that suggests that, and sometimes it's not actually very weak, like near misses actually are weak signals really. They're quite loud signals if you're paying attention to them. But near misses, as an example, control failures in the field. If you've got control verification activity happening in the field, every single time you have a compliance of a critical control is a great indicator that you're actually going to have a problem down the track. And from a board perspective and an executive level management perspective, you really want to know that, because that then tells you where you focus your attention and energy and ramp up, that kind of focus around risk management.
Yeah. Well, and I think you've sort of answered this question to an extent there, Warren, about how can metrics impact on SIF prevention. So it is about those weak signals and the ability to recognise those as potentially having an impact on SIF potential events. Is that a fair summary of?
Absolutely. That's you put it beautifully. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, another opportunity for a poll here. So we're talking about SIF, so serious injury and fatality potential events here. I'd like our listeners to have a reflection on their own organisation again, and we'll see what comes back. So what we'd love to hear from you about is how well does your organisation categorise incidents as serious injury and fatality potential versus minor, not SIF? So are you looking at the potential of those incidents clearly and accurately in a way that helps manage future potential events? People right on those polls. Excellent to see that come through. All right, we've got a bit of they're still ticking over. Give another 5 seconds or so. Great, thanks, Cassie. We'll finish the poll up there. Excellent. So we can see there by the polls, we had 10% felt that they were doing this very well in an excellent way. We had 27% saying above average, 29% average, 31% below average, and 3% very poorly. So Warren, again, any surprises in this data?
Not really, because I think most people who are, particularly those who are responsible for their safety management system, some of the the systems within the system, they generally will have designed that with really positive intent in mind. And in fact, probably the structure of it's actually really at a very good standard. What happens is in practice though, is when you actually get to apply that in the field and you're asking supervisors, managers, superintendents to actually make the calls around what is a serious injury or fatality risk situation versus one that isn't, their judgment can be quite varied. They're coming from their own biases. Sometimes there's kind of system issues that contribute to that. In other words, do I really want to make this one sit at the high level of, in the red zone on the risk matrix? Probably not, because there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to happen after that I'm not really comfortable with. And this data you've just put up on screen suggests that we had a look at over 2,000 incidents across 6 organisations last year and the year before, and we analysed how those organisations rated those incidents against a very similar risk matrix, a 5-step model, from really serious catastrophic level down to practically no risk whatsoever. And what was surprising to us was the sheer volume of incidents that just didn't make the cut that should have done as a serious event. Most of those events, of course, it was all about potential rather than actual. Very hard to misclassify an actual serious incident. But it's all of those ones that really probably should have made the cut that just flew under the radar, as I was saying here, nearly half of incidents that we're using a very structured, systemic approach to actually analyse incidents. Half of them didn't make it that should have done. What was interesting, though, that 29% of those incidents that did make the cut probably didn't need to. In fact, they weren't really that serious when it comes to actual potential for serious injury or fatality or critical business process breakdown. So there's a fair bit of wasted effort, and that effort really needs to be redirected at incidents that typically tend to fly, under the radar when they shouldn't. So the structure is usually not about the system that's been designed. It's usually about the application of it and how people interface with that when they're actually making their rating. It's very inconsistent.
Okay, so to play back what I think I've heard there, Warren, so 45% of of incidents with serious potential went under the radar in this study of over 2,000 individual incidents. But then a lot of attention was getting focused on things that didn't have such a significant potential attached to them. So why did those 29% get that additional attention? Was it because of the actual consequence of the incident, or do you have any insights into that?
Yeah, so look, typically, a lost time injury, if somebody twists an ankle and they're off work for 5, 6, 7 days because they're required to walk in their role, and it was the worst possible outcome that you could imagine in that situation, and therefore not a serious injury or fatality risk, merely because it's a lost time injury, and a lost time injury with more than X number of days involved, it will tend to fall into the category of needing to have a deep dive investigation when we actually know there's fairly simple contributing factors. And it's that kind of incident that unfortunately, we see routinely getting almost ICAM level investigations when they probably don't need them.
Sure. Yeah, certainly in my experience, what I've seen play out in a number of organisations is, and I had an incident a little while ago, and broadly speaking, someone stepped out of a truck, injured their knee and had to get quite major surgery on that knee. In the same time frame, someone fell from a ladder at quite a height, was fairly nimble, landed, jarred their back a little bit. So the actual consequence of the incident was quite low. And it was really interesting to look at the different level of attention that the two incidents got. And to your point, the ladder situation pretty much flew under the radar, where the knee situation became a significant conversation. It rolled all the way up to the board level.
Yeah, I mean, it's not to say when people get hurt, it's serious to them. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. We're trying to draw a line here between really serious injury or fatality potential. Typically, fatality potential, where somebody could actually be, permanently harmed as a result. And it's usually a fairly small subset of incidents that fall into that category.
Yeah, great. So we're talking a lot about incidents with serious injury and fatality. Why do we need to know about minor incidents when they occur?
Amy, you or me?
I think we can both do this one. What do you reckon? Look, I'll jump in first and say it's about those weak signals that Warren was mentioning, and it's about getting the information early, identifying patterns over time, and I think Warren was painting a really nice picture there too about understanding the risk and the potential risk that's attached to something. Yeah, Warren, I'll throw to you.
Yeah, as you can see, thanks for that, Amy. This really neat diagram is showing what a lot of us already know about SIF potential, is that about 1 in 5 incidents in most organisations, it varies from industry to industry, obviously organisation to organisation, but one in 5 incidents, no matter what their level of outcome or the severity of outcome, will tend to have SIF potential. So relatively innocuous looking, benign kind of outcomes that don't look very important on the surface. 1 in 5 of those will also have some significant concerns for us. And that goes to even near misses. Well, certainly goes to near misses, but it even goes to hazards. It even goes to, control breakdowns in the field, where somebody just skips a step in a procedure. That critical procedure could be something that really is important to follow, by the letter, step by step. You start skipping steps in the procedure, you can be lucky this time, you can be lucky 100 times, but eventually law of averages suggests that's going to cause a major breakdown. And if it's something under pressure, something involves, explosive capacity, isolations, all of those things. Like a lot of people on this call, on this webinar, who are in the audience will be very familiar with isolation breakdowns and the kinds of serious problems that can occur. But if you're not tracking and recording those, you don't really know what's likely to land right down the bottom of this model and land in the serious injury and fatality space. So it's really important to collect that data and see it as part of a broader risk management lens.
Right. All right. So again, to play back what I think I've heard there. So every near miss or incident has a potential to be a learning opportunity if we frame it as such. So what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to identify serious incidents that could occur in the future through aggregating weak signals, looking for patterns in that information, and also having a balanced focus. So again, looking at those weak signals and probably giving a proportionate amount of focus to potential of incidents, the potential of incidents, and the actual outcomes of incidents. Have I heard that correctly, Warren and Amy?
Yeah, I think that covers it pretty well, Ant.
Okay, great. So organizations getting all this incident data in, and it sounds like there's huge opportunity to do more with that data to reduce the risk profile of organizations and get more people home safe and every single day. How do we tackle this challenge?
It's a great question. I think it's about looking at that value that the organization has in safety, so that level of safety culture maturity. How are they communicating that to their people? What level of trust and psychological safety have they built up around that reporting process? And that's where I think when we look at organizations that are doing really well in that in their level of underreporting, and so they're collecting that incident data that they really need, that's where we'll see that psychological safety climate, we'll see trust, we'll see a strong sense of leadership commitment to safety, and so those cultural elements are really there. I think we've also briefly talked about that idea of learning from these incidents and feeding that information back, and so these sorts of organizations are really making an effort to take in that information, to learn about it, to demonstrate action, demonstrate change. And by feeding that information back, you're actually avoiding that blame or fearful situation, and you're also avoiding the situation where people feel nothing ever changes, nothing's ever done. And so that's probably my best answer for you there. And I think when you're talking culture change, it starts to get something that needs a lot of work and a lot of time, and there's a lot of levers attached to culture change, but it certainly has a big impact in this underreporting space.
I can imagine. So there's a whole range of organizational factors from what I'm hearing that can contribute to, one, whether we're getting the information, two, what the quality of the information we're getting, and three, what we do with that information, and is it useful and practical moving forward. Warren, did you have any other thoughts in terms of those enablers?
I think Amy's covered it beautifully. I would just say my frame around this, is probably, in some ways, it's actually fairly simple. One is identify your barriers. The barriers to reporting in the first place, and Amy called them out beautifully before. It's unsafe, it's too hard, nothing will get done, and there's obviously lots of different ways of saying all of that, but they're usually the 3 or 4 basic elements. So you need to actually address those barriers once you've identified them, if they relate to your organisation. And some of those are actually trickier than others to deal with. Like recrafting the system to make it really easy. We can tick that box actually fairly. Like it's just changing the administrative workflow. It's looking at, what unnecessary work is being asked to be done here, by supervisors and frontline workers, and let's just get rid of it. The unsafe piece, is a cultural issue, and that obviously comes down to how the leaders respond to incidents first and foremost. And I think, once they get their heads around the fact that to maximise reporting, they've got to be constantly self-aware about how they articulate and what they say about things that go wrong, and also how they respond to individuals that they feel they really want to blame And sometimes, somebody does make a stupid mistake. Do they make intentional mistakes? Hardly ever in my experience. Intended acts of sabotage in an organisation, sabotaging self or organisation, just really, rarely ever happen. So usually we're just trying to get the job done. And once you wrap your head around that from a leader's perspective, it can kind of take you back a few steps before you overreact to an incident. Because if you're going to craft a learning culture and try and consciously create a learning culture around this, you actually really need the absolute opposite. You need to celebrate. Every unplanned outcome is an opportunity for learning, and to really inculcate that into how you think and how you speak and how you engage your people, and then you have to make it worthwhile to Joe and Mary and Adam at the front line by showing that when you report this particular situation, we will respond and take action to reduce your exposure next time. And we'll do it in a way that actually engages you in that decision-making process about how to fix that problem, because you probably know best. You probably know better than we do as leaders. And as long as you've ticked all those boxes, it's amazing how fast reporting, will move.
Yeah, right.
Sorry,
yeah, it's really no, it's a really interesting conversation, because I think part of the reason we've obviously at Centre's partnered with incident analytics is for the last 20 years we've been collecting data on organizational cultural drivers for why certain things happen. And I think where there's some excellent synergies here is we provide the perceptions and the organizational data. And what I've been astounded by as we've been partnered together is how the incident data and the culture data just seems to line up, and it just provides nearly like a 3D understanding of what's happening for organizations, both helpful and hindering when it comes to learning from unplanned events and creating positive change to manage potential events. Warren, I'd be curious to hear a little bit more from you. What does it look like to get the right information? And when you look at using incident data to inform nearly safety strategy and safety decision making, how are you crunching the data? What are you looking at understanding? What does good look like?
Well, we've talked to a lot of organisations over the years about their incidents. We've had a lot, as you can imagine, we've looked at a lot of incident investigation outputs, thousands of them actually. And what struck us is that organisations have this, we work with, have this extraordinary body of information at their fingertips. From a learning perspective, like it's unparalleled. The fact that you were prepared to invest hours and hours and hours of an internal expert's time to try and extract good learning from each thing that goes wrong, but then not aggregate that data and try and make sense of it at a business intelligence level, that to me seems like a waste. And that's why incident analytics came about, really, because it was probably in response to organisations saying, we're deeply frustrated with the fact we have these incidents happening over and over and over again, despite doing pretty serious investigation and exploring why those things have occurred and taking action. So I think the kinds of things that we've found organisations get tremendous benefit from is to be able to stand back at about 1,000 foot and be able to look at a short history of incidents that all have serious injury and fatality potential, and have a look at why did the controls break down. Because we don't need to just play the man here. I mean, obviously there's always a worker involved. Well, typically there's a worker involved, but it's not just about the worker. If the worker had a slip or lapse or mistake, what encouraged that mistake or slip or lapse to even occur in the first place? It's really important to look at the latent factors that kind of contribute, the system factors that contribute to people making mistakes or errors at the front line. But being able to see it from a 1,000-foot perspective and seeing a larger body of incidents, you can start to see patterns in breakdowns that are going to predict other incidents from occurring in the near future, and sometimes quite near future. So this kind of dashboard, we see it in finance, we see it in production, but we don't see it in safety to the same degree, and that's what we find organisations actually really badly need.
So this helps organisations play the ball and not the player. And That's a relief to hear, because certainly having spent a lot of time with Amy over the years looking at organizational data and then hearing about incidents that happen within organizations, I must admit there's been several times where I've gone, you know, if I'd been put in the same set of circumstances as that worker, I probably would have made the same stupid error. And what's been really fascinating to unpack with this incident data is that the same stupid errors can sometimes happen multiple times across an organization. But each time, you know, it's the person that can be, that the focus can be aimed at. So, you know, we talk about the concept of locus control at centers. I really see this tool combined, particularly with the culture diagnostics, as a great opportunity for organizations and leaders within those organizations to ask themselves, what's our 50% in this incident, and how do we enable safe work for the worker? How do we manage as best we possibly can to get people into the best working environment that's going to support them to make great choices. Amy, any additional comments on this from you?
Yes, just about to say, I think, look, the process you've just described there is exactly the process for building that sense of psychological safety, right, and that sense of trust. And by focusing beyond the worker, by understanding the situation, by working to improve, as you said, your 50%, the part that you've got that control over, I think that's where your people start to see and build that sense of trust and build that sense of psychological safety. So they know that when they do bring an issue themselves in the future, that they're not going to get hit over the head, per se.
Right. So we're going to launch into question section shortly. So I'll get people to start having to think about any questions that they may have or any comments that they'd like to make. Finally, though, what's one recommendation from Amy, you first, and then Warren, that you would both make to help organisations improve their ability to learn from incidents?
Yeah, I reckon it's about approaching things with a curious mind. So if we can get our leaders approaching things with that sense of curiosity, that interest to learn, that's where we start to shift that reporting culture from one where it's a real chore, something you've got to do to be compliant, to something that is useful. And so I think if we can start approaching things with a curious mindset, I think that's probably the first step.
Great, Amy. And Warren?
Yeah.
It's a tough question, this, because it's only one. I've got many.
I'll give you two, Warren.
Look, I think I'll wrap it up in one. Hopefully it's not a triple-barreled response. I think it's really important, for organisations to be able to show to themselves, with reliable data, how the linkage between an unplanned event occurring, having a really good understanding about the causal factors, and developing really solid actions that have got a high chance of actually reducing exposure that caused that incident in the first, or that unplanned event in the first place. But then being able to road test how well that's been implemented in the field, and has it even been implemented? And then being able to show that there's a reduction of that risk occurring, and the evidence would be in outcomes. It would be in lag metrics then, but it's being able to tie that together as a total reporting system. You then got a real-time kind of risk assurance mechanism, and I think that's so. I go to systems, typically. I know, behaviour is really important here. Leadership and culture is really important, but for me, the system is often what's missing as well.
Right. All right. There's some really useful insights, Amy and Warren. Look, just a quick summary of some key opportunities, just like an infomercial that you see on TV where the cake's already baked. A couple of ideas that listeners can take along are, you can have a think about understanding the why and the how underreporting is occurring in your organisation. Again, getting a good grip. Is underreporting a challenge? Is it not? And if it is, what are the drivers of that? It's a great place to start, because otherwise you're potentially flying a little bit blind. Thinking about responses to safety incidents and near misses. It's can feel like a really counterintuitive thing to celebrate getting what's nearly bad news, I think, is framed up by some leaders. But challenging our frames around, well, all data is good data and it's going to enable us to create a safer workplace will possibly help us to create a more positive response. And that feeds really nicely into the third point there of looking at the attitude of continuous improvement and learning. Every incident, every event that occurs, planned or otherwise, is an opportunity for that continuous learning, that continuous improvement. So instilling that in your leadership team becomes really important. And then the last key takeaway is, are you looking at your incident data in a more dynamic way? Are you looking at incidents as one-off events, or are you actually looking at, all right, what stories does our incident data tell us, and how can we use that data and the story that data is telling us to potentially predict or hopefully make weak signals clearer so that we can take preventative actions on those incidents that could have those seriously strong or fatal outcomes. So thank you both. We're going to, again, jump into the questions in just a moment. A couple of quick call to actions whilst everyone is putting their questions in. If you'd like to know more about the tools that we've spoken about here, so firstly, our safety culture diagnostic process, one of our teams can get in contact with you. Hit yes on the poll, and someone will reach out and say a quick g'day, or hit no, or just don't respond, and you won't hear from us in regards to that. Just give it another minute or so. I think the interesting thing about this tool is that it's all presented in a data analytics platform, so you can drill up, drill down, get really clear and specific data about what's working well and what's not working well. So those votes are still rolling in. I'll give it another second or so. Great. All right. Well, we'll close that poll down. Thank you. And we'll move to the next poll. And this is in relation to that incident severity analysis tool. So if you've got interest in this tool, please drop yes in the box and one of us will get in contact with you. So what this tool, as we've said, essentially does is enables organizations to drop their data in and look at understanding, well, what are the trends? What are the trends that we see around our incident data? Excellent. All right. Well, we might turn that poll off. Thank you, Cassie. And we will launch into the Q&A space now. So we've actually had a question come through on the chat whilst we've been talking. So Amy and Warren, if that's okay, we might tackle that one first. So it says, with the percentage of incidents not being reported, do you have a breakdown in the stats of the types of incidents being underreported? Example, bullying, psychosocial bullying, harassment versus physical, such as musculoskeletal, degloving, etc. So I think Warren, maybe one for you. Are you looking at those psychosocial risks as well as those physical risks that organisations may be experiencing? And do you see the same levels of underreporting?
Anthony, with the approach we take to incident analysis, and we're looking for serious injury or fatality risk incidents, typically we're talking about acute events. So the psychosocial related incidents, whilst they're completely real, and organisations obviously have to take full account of those kinds of incidents, they don't usually make the cut in an acute sense because they often take time, and as do the musculoskeletal type incidents, and often like a repetitive strain injury that is identified as something that requires time off work. It can get worse and worse, and then we're talking about somebody who's actually somewhat disabled and not able to to operate in a full-time job anymore. We also don't look at those either because they're very hard to identify in that instant that the event has occurred as being serious. So just just in terms of the serious injury and fatality risk world, in terms of analysis and research and so forth, we tend to sort of petition those things off. But I'm not suggesting that they're not important. They are very important. And the same kind of drivers. There are weak signals to those events, of course, as we all know, and we should be trying to identify those weak signals as well.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And Amy, this is probably, well, I know this is a passion area of your own. So have we been able to identify anything through the data that we've collected around the difference in reporting?
Yep, so the data that we've got for the benchmarking percentages are just the number of experienced incidents versus the number of reported incidents and looking at that difference. So across our safety climate survey, we don't pull apart the type of incident that's being underreported there, but we do see that kind of data coming through in our safety culture diagnostics, where we're going out and talking to people, running interviews and focus groups. And the trend that we tend to see there is those more serious physical injuries are generally more obvious, so they do tend to get reported. The psychological injuries are the ones that the system may not actually be set up to receive reports on just yet in some organisations. So we do hear about that. We do hear that that psychological sense of bullying or stress or burnout isn't actually picked up properly in those systems in a lot of organisations. And again, I think there's a lot of space for improvement in that psychological well-being. And that is something that we do assess as well for an organisation that's interested in assessing wellbeing climate and psychological safety too.
There are also different drivers, aren't there, Amy, when it comes to psychosocial related incidents. There's a different kind of reluctance to report. It's actually quite difficult to get people to be open about some of those situations. As distinct from I cut my finger, it's pretty obvious, and it's okay to report that.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a complicated thing to provide evidence for as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you both. Now we've got 8 minutes and we've got quite a few questions to rip into. So for listeners, we'll hopefully get to as many questions as we can, and any that we don't get to, we might try and circulate some responses to those later on via the email that we send out. So we'll kick off with the first question here. So after introducing the near miss and hazard reporting incentive scheme, at what point should an organisation halt the scheme? So this person has said, experience has told me that employees tend to abuse a scheme for their own benefits by creating hazards and then reporting them to management. So someone who's had a not so positive experience with a reporting incentive scheme by the sounds of it.
Can I jump in, Amy, and just say,
yes,
don't do it in the first place.
Yeah.
Incentivised reporting schemes are just not, they're actually going to get you these kinds of negative outcomes every time. It isn't the right kind of motivation. There needs to be a far more sort of culturally sustainable approach, to try and generate greater activity in this space than giving people trinkets or vouchers or whatever. It never works, and it has never worked for organisations that I've had anything to do with.
Yeah.
Thanks, Byron.
Yep.
Yeah.
I agree, Warren. I think if you're in that situation where it's already happening, then I'd recommend a really slow transition out of it. So you might sort of move into that more intermittent reward. So certain reports will be selected for that reward rather than every hazard receiving that reward. And I'd also look to where can you reward safe behaviour. So shifting that attention from reporting the problems to rewarding the positive things. And if you're communicating the value of the reports, when you've got good reports, it's giving you useful information, when you can demonstrate that learning, that starts shifting that from that external motivation, I'm looking for the reward, to that internal motivation. What I'm doing is actually useful for me. It's useful for the people that I work with. By sharing this information, we're making our workplace safer. We're getting people home safely to their families and their loved ones. So I think if we can start to shift that attention, it becomes, as Warren was saying, that more internally driven motivation.
Excellent. Yeah, really useful responses. The next one I think is a really interesting question that I think a lot of people will be reflecting on is, are there any insights that suggest that underreporting is more prevalent in an organisation with a strong blame culture?
Yeah,
Do
very
you want
much.
to tackle that one, Amy? Yeah. Yeah,
Yes,
very much. Yep.
yes, very much. Yeah, that's probably my fast answer. They're absolutely 100% right there. Blame culture equals a lot more underreporting, and that's where we have to separate the idea that if you've got a high level of reporting that you've got problems. It's actually the opposite, that when we see that high level of reporting, we generally have that more mature culture that values that report, values that information, so you have people willing to share it. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. It's really interesting when I've worked with many organisations, you'll see that near miss reporting go up, and the initial response is sometimes a threat response from organisations. Where have all these things come from? You know, but it's actually a byproduct of people feeling that they are more comfortable to report. So how do we? So a lot about this comfort in reporting that we've spoke about throughout the session is linked back to the concept of psychological safety, and that's been a phrase or a term that's been thrown around a little bit, and we've got a whole webinar on this on our website if anyone would like to jump on and take a look. But Amy, what would be some hot tips that you would suggest to listen to people on the call around how to cultivate a psychologically safe environment?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. As I mentioned before, being curious is a big part of it. And that involves shifting that blame from the individual to sort of understanding the situation first. And it's also about considering reactions. How, if I provide this piece of information, if I don't provide this piece of information, how people are going to react, and trying to anticipate some of that. And the other thing would be owning up and sharing your own mistakes. So the times where things haven't gone well for you, if we're honest about that, then that builds that sense of safety that somebody else can be honest to. And lastly, this is your reaction in that moment. And sometimes we react poorly, and that's where we get that chance to actually go back and own up to that mistake and say, hey, look, you know, I didn't respond the best this morning. I'm really sorry about that. Look, can we have another go? Yeah.
That's great. Okay, well, thank you, Amy. And this next one, Warren, I mean, we mentioned earlier the challenges with incentivizing reporting and those incentive schemes. How else can we go about encouraging the workforce to speak up and report from their experience?
I think there's even some really basic grassroots opportunities here, Anthony. When it comes to, you know, if a supervisor is holding a pre-start or a toolbox session, you know, with their crew, these are the sorts of things that can be that can be preempted. You know, like work is never going to go 100% as expected. Not in our current really complex, you know, kind of socio-technical, you know, kind of work environments, you know, where you've got an awful lot that's actually really left up to the creativity of the worker. It's very hard to provide 100% perfect equipment, PPE, you know, work process, all those procedures that actually really probably aren't completely up to date. So people have to be creative. There's going to be things that don't go as expected. There's going to be decisions that then have to be made by that frontline worker about how to manage that situation without necessarily deferring to somebody else. Hopefully they actually do canvass, with their people. And then when something does go wrong, it's simply got to be preempted and called out, and beforehand as the learning opportunity we need to know about. And every supervisor, every team leader, every superintendent, every frontline manager, needs to be grabbing every opportunity they can to reinforce the need for those learning moments, and therefore a meaningful discussion about what's happened, not just a three-word glib, note in the instant management system. It doesn't, like, more information is better here. And I think over time, if you're consistent with that over time, people start to feel like this is actually something useful to do.
Excellent. Thank you, Warren. That's some great insights. I'm just mindful of time. Thank you both, Amy and Warren, for answering some of those questions have been, and obviously taking us through your insights around underreporting and the implications for serious injury and fatality prevention. We'll be sending out some additional information to people live on the call and people who couldn't make it at the time as well, and we'll take some time to answer some of these questions as well. I'd also like to thank everyone who's taken the time to dial in today and listen live to this. It shows a really positive intent to invest in your people and to get more people home safe. And it's very much, again, in line with Centus's mission as it is for the Internet Analytics team. So again, happy Thursday or whenever you may be listening to this, and we'll hopefully see you on a call again soon. Bye for now.
Thanks, Sam.